Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I have another mystery subgenre deep dive with the always popular locked room mystery. This is a locked room slash impossible crime. Those are two different things, and I was looking forward to this one in particular because, like the cozies, I think the term locked room is frequently misused. It has a very specific definition that is it's sort of obvious when you think about it, but I will go all into the definitions and the history of this very popular and creative subgenre. There are no spoilers in this video, and before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Usually I start off with the history, but this time I will start with defining the term locked room mystery. And the term is self explanatory. A locked room mystery requires just that, a locked room. And you might be thinking, well, duh, of course, but the term locked room mystery gets thrown around a lot. It literally requires a locked room. It gets confused with the broader category of the impossible crime, which I'll get into in a minute. All locked room mysteries are impossible crimes, but not all impossible crimes are locked room mysteries. And disclaimer here, I'm going to mention quite a few novels in this video that are at least impossible crimes and not necessarily locked room mysteries. The academic research on this subject often does not discern between these two, and because there's hundreds and thousands of impossible crimes and locked room mysteries, I may accidentally call a novel a locked room mystery when it's really just an impossible crime. I have a great memory, but I cannot recall the exact details of all of these novels and stories, so I may make a mistake on that front. I'll try not to. I do not recall every single detail of every single John Dixon Carr novel, so a locked room mystery has to have a locked room that makes ingress and or egress into the room seemingly impossible. But what about the impossible crime? Well, an impossible crime is a mystery in which the circumstances of the murder or theft or whatever crime are seemingly impossible to have been committed. This may or may not include a locked room. I know most people would probably not consider it such, but Agatha Christie's Death in the Clouds is an impossible crime, but not a locked room. It's an impossible crime because the circumstances of Madame Giselle's death by poison dart are seemingly impossible to have been pulled off. She was under observation in the small plane, and it's not possible to have used the blow dart gun or for anyone to have murdered her in the way it seems she was murdered. But it's not a locked room because she's not in a locked room, she's on an airplane. The impossible crime encompasses all of the mysteries where the established circumstances mean investigators cannot explain how the crime was committed, never mind who did it. An impossible crime doesn't mean that it's unknown how the victim was murdered. It really means the exact opposite. The mechanics of the murder are known, but they seemingly couldn't have happened. It's impossible that they happened the way it appeared to be. And of course, the locked room is the most traditional and common form of impossible crime. A locked room that has no windows or locked windows, or is up several stories with no balcony, and has not been broken into means a killer couldn't have entered that room without a key. And usually the key holder, first of all, the key holder isn't the killer. Second, is far away from the crime scene, or most often I've noticed is that the locked room is locked from the inside, which makes it even harder for someone to escape. So having a key, doesn't mean anything. The entire story usually has one or two lines of investigation. Usually, the key to solving whodunit is figuring out the trick of the locked room. How was the murder committed? And that will usually indicate which person did it. Think like murder in Mesopotamia. Once you figure out how, there is only one who. It couldn't be anyone else once you figure out how. The other less common way is the detective will figure out who done it and then try to figure out how that person did it. And I think this method is used less often just for convenience sake, but there's a lot of merit to it. Again, I think that's how the reader would solve a locked room more often. You can figure out who did it and then just try to figure out how they pulled it off. Okay, that's not usually the path the author and the detective take, though. In a locked room, it's usually much easier to figure out who than how. I have to be honest, I don't ever recall being able to solve the mechanics of a locked room mystery on a first read. They are usually extremely convoluted and complex, and the clues are there to solve them, but let's be honest, no one is solving these. I don't know anyone who has ever solved a John Dixon Carr novel by solving the mechanics. Let me know in the comments if you have done so. I won't believe you, but tell me anyway. But typically, in a locked room mystery, the murderer is the most obvious suspect. I know critics love to mock locked room mysteries by calling them unrealistic, but no one would ever commit murders this way in real life. Only in books would someone think of these like completely bizarre murder methods and mechanics. And yes, that's true to an extent, but there are also real life examples of locked room mysteries. The Benson murder case by S.S. Van Dyne is based on the real life murder of J.B. Elwell, which is still unsolved over 100 years later. But there's a very logical reason for having a locked room mystery outside of just the fun of it. Locked rooms and impossible crimes obfuscate from the obvious. The killer is very often the most likely suspect, and this is how the killer repels suspicion away from them. We also see this in non impossible crimes where the killer is just the most likely suspect on the face of it. The killer is going to be suspected right off the bat. Usually the spouse of the victim or some other kind of like known mortal enemy or heir of the victim, and they have to get the attention away from them, distract the police and the reader by having this ridiculous puzzle or by making it look like they couldn't have done it. It's such a tried and true thing, and readers know this, but readers often miss this. I miss this a lot. And now let's get into a little bit of the history here. I always assumed the world's first locked room mystery was The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is a classic by Edgar Allan Poe, published in 1841. However, when I double checked my research here, I found there was an even earlier locked room mystery called A Passage in the Secret History of an Irish Countess, which I had never heard of before. It doesn't sound like a mystery story, to be honest. It was written in 1838 by Sheridan Le Fanu, who I have heard of. Le Fanu did write mysteries, but he's better known for his ghost stories and vampire stories. He's writing vampire stories before Dracula, decades before Dracula. He also apparently invented lesbian vampire fiction, so that's something. His best known novel, a mystery novel actually, is Uncle Silas, a locked room mystery based on a passage in the secret history of an Irish countess. And I have read Uncle Silas, and to be honest, I really don't remember a lot about it. And I think Le Fanu's association with ghost stories may be a factor in why many locked room mysteries have supernatural elements to them. Not actual supernatural elements, of course, but you often see a lot of talk like, oh, the victim must have seen a ghost and got scared to death because there's no other way this could have happened. And oftentimes, locked rooms are in like haunted houses or haunted castles or something like that. Uncle Silas does have some spookiness to it, if I remember correctly. It's been a while. There are a lot of classic locked room mysteries that predate the golden age of detective fiction. Many golden age authors drew inspiration from these locked room mysteries. The biggest one probably is Gaston Leroux's The Mystery of the Yellow Room. Leroux, better known today for writing The Phantom of the Opera, not the musical version, the play, the novel version. Arthur Conan Doyle has a bunch of locked room mysteries with Sherlock Holmes, mostly short stories, notably The Adventure of the Speckled Band, which is a personal favorite of mine. There are a lot of locked room mysteries from G.K. Chesterton featuring Father Brown. The Miracle of Moon Crescent is one of these. And I've always found it interesting that a lot of Golden Age authors are inspired by locked room mysteries and their authors, but often did not write them themselves. We see a lot of Golden Age writers steering away from these. Now, most of the most famous ones do have like one or two locked room mysteries. Christie has 2 locked room mystery novels out of 66. She does have a few more short stories. Ellery Queen has like 1 or 2 locked room novels. The Chinese Orange Mystery, but is not a ubiquitous presence in the Cousins novels. It's like that for a lot of authors. They like experimented here and there with it, but did not take that on as a feature of their work. And really, by the Golden Age, locked room mysteries were more prominently featured in short stories or even comic books. Like the Ellery Queen magazine was full of them. They had an association with being a bit pulpy. And I think largely that's because the focus is on the puzzle and not the characters, although there's no real reason to exclude character work from a locked room mystery. Also, their association with short stories, I think, comes from a few places. I think some authors looked at locked room mystery and didn't see enough like content for a full length novel, while others it was just not for them. Christie mentioned this a lot, where she liked reading locked room mysteries, but she just found they weren't like for her to write. A lot of authors don't enjoy like crafting complex mechanics. They'd rather do the more fun like character work or other type of mysteries where they don't have to make sure everything is like perfectly aligned. However, we do have authors who specialized in locked room mysteries. I have to mention John Dixon Carr slash Carter Dixon's the same person here, who is really the master of the locked room mystery. The Hollow Man, also called Three Coffins, is often called the world's greatest locked room mystery. I've never really like thought about what I think the world's greatest locked room mystery is, but that's certainly in the running. In this book, Carr has the infamous lecture on locked room mysteries. It's chapter 17. It's a very well-known speech in which Gideon Fell basically goes into a deep dive on locked rooms. Gideon Fell, by the way, heavily based on G.K. Chesterton, who also wrote a lot of locked room mysteries. And locked room mysteries have always been around and continue to be written. I think advancements in technology have rendered them a lot more difficult to pull off because things like the victim is unlikely to be secluded in a locked room. I think these things are a lot harder to pull off today. There are less of them for sure. And nowadays, they're mostly more commonly associated with Asian language mysteries, in particularly the Japanese. They love their locked room mysteries in Japan, and they often combine them with the psychological thriller. And they almost take on like a horror like feel to it. As I've mentioned before, I'm a casual gamer and I do play a lot of mystery video games. A lot of them are Japanese origins and they are full of locked room mysteries, very complex, very complicated to an almost fantastic degree. The Ace Attorney franchise being one that really goes all in on the impossible crimes, often not very realistically, but always a lot of fun. I haven't read too many like Asian language mystery novels, but from what I understand, locked room mysteries are still very popular and very complex. In the US, we do tend to see these more often in the form of like films and TV shows and video games rather than novels. I imagine it's the same way in Europe. And the locked room mysteries and the impossible crimes should not be confused, as is often the case, with another subgenre called the closed circle of suspects. I don't want to go too in depth here because the closed circle of suspects is a subgenre for another time. But the key difference is that in a locked room mystery, it is the victim that is secluded from the other characters. In the closed circle of suspects, it's the entire cast of characters that is secluded from the rest of the world. It can only be those people. Death in the Clouds, again, both an impossible crime and a closed circle of suspects. Hercule Poirot's Christmas is a locked room mystery, but not a closed circle of suspects. Death on the Nile is not a locked room mystery, but it is a closed circle of suspects. There is a difference, and I often see them used interchangeably when they really shouldn't be. And I want to give my personal opinion on the locked room. I love locked rooms and impossible crimes. I always have so much fun trying to figure out how the murder happened. I often fail at doing it. I consider myself pretty good at figuring out who done it, but I am far less adept at solving how done it, the mechanics of a locked room mystery. And there are some key clues you can use. I mean, typically the solution is actually very simple. There are exceptions, of course, but usually the more complex the mechanics, the simpler the murder really is. And, people are critical of locked room mysteries. They call them unrealistic. And as I already mentioned, there are real world examples of locked room mysteries. These do happen in real life. And moreover, I always talk about how a reader should be willing to suspend some credibility for the sake of the clever mystery, and the locked room is the epitome of that. I give locked rooms far more leeway in the credibility area than I do all the other subgenres, but I would reiterate that also that the very best mystery novels, including the very best locked room mystery novels, do both. They are both credible and clever. I think of the likes of the Chinese Orange Mystery, which is an extremely clever plot, and it's only somewhat credible. And when it comes to the mechanics of the murder, it's not really credible at all. It's ridiculous. Whereas you have multiple John Dixon Carr novels where he's able to convincingly sell you the locked room mechanics. Even some of his most complicated ones, you can fully believe that happened. That's what makes him like the king of the locked room mystery. Now, does he always do that? No. There are some that are just really just too mind-boggling to believe. But John Dixon Carr really can get you to believe pretty much anything in his books. And that is it for this video. Let me know what you think about Locked Room / Impossible Crimes in the comments. These are classics here. And next week, since it is May, and in the US at least, we have a lot of graduations going on. So I thought we'd all go back to college, Shrewsbury College at Oxford specifically, for some let's say, wild adventures with Harriet Vane and Lord Peter Wimsey in the often controversial Gaudy Night by Dorothy L. Sayers, celebrating 90 years in 2025. This is a rather interesting novel to discuss. Lots of people have really like polar opposite feelings about this one, often very extreme. I like to say there's sort of like a delusional syndrome here. I mean, some people are absolutely deranged about Gaudy Night in both directions. There are people who love this, who would marry this book if they could, and there are other people who are willing to throw it on fire. So, which, by the way, does happen in this novel. But I'll go all into that next week. Until next time, Mystery Files.